Everyone, can everyone hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. I can see only a few of you. Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone. My name is Tiffany Chang. I use she, her pronouns, joining you from the traditional land of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway tribe in DC. And love to introduce our folks first, but if you're comfortable, please add your name, your pronouns, where you're joining us from, in the chat. And we also invite you, if you'd like, to share one piece of Asian American history that you wish you had learned in school, or if you don't identify as Asian American, any piece of history that is of particular significance to you. Like I said, my name is Tiffany Chang. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Advancing Justice AAJC. I'm also joined here by Joy Guzman, our Manager of Community Engagement, as well as our whole AAJC family. I know Nicole, Ari, Amy, Vivian, Juan, Yuhuan are all online, so feel free to say hello in the chat, folks. And just to model what we were just talking about here, things that we wish we learned in school, or we wish that we had known growing up, is my father told me that the Chinese American architect I.M. Pei, who designed the National Gallery of Art here in DC and also the Louvre Pyramid in France, his brother was actually an illustrious scientist who actually chose my father to receive a scholarship to actually move from Taiwan to the Western Hemisphere for the University of Waterloo. And that's significant to me because, you know, he found this needle in a haystack from all of these applications. And because we had that representation, because we had somebody championing and believing that, that immigrants could add to the richness of our community, that totally changed the course of my family's life. So definitely check out I.M. Pei's work, and yeah, I just appreciate that that little slice of history that my father shared. So I'm gonna pass it over to Joy, and please continue to share your own historical facts in the chat.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. Hi, everybody. My name is Joy Guzman. Like Tiffany said, I'm the Manager of Community Engagement here at Advancing Justice, AAJC. And something that I learned about later that I wish I had known growing up is I wish I had learned in high school or even earlier about the role that Filipino Americans played in the labor rights movement, right? I didn't learn about Pablo Manlapit until way later. Even though I was a Filipino American growing up in Southern California, I never knew about the role that Filipino Americans played in that movement. And I wish I had learned that sooner because it's something that I'm now very proud of. So something that was not in my history books.
Awesome. So thanks so much for sharing, Joy. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what others join in the chat. Our collective memories are really powerful. And they help us self-actualize and realize our own power, right? So before we actually get started with the main presentation, I just wanted to go over a few community guidelines here. Before we kind of move into this space, would love everyone to know that we will be recording the main portion of our presentation today. And, you know, in order to create the best environment for mutual learning and collaboration, I'd like us to invite us to ground ourselves in our community guidelines. Each of you, upon registering for this event, agreed to bring your best selves into this space, where we have people of all ages, backgrounds, and levels of experience with us. So we ask that each of us remains respectful of all speakers and participants throughout the duration of this event. We love lively discussion. It's okay to react or disagree with things. We encourage the use of emojis, the chat box, questions, but please know that any hateful, derogatory speech or disruptive behavior will result in removal from the meeting. It takes a lot to take the time to be here with us, so we want to honor that for all of our participants and speakers today. We also want to commit ourselves to personal growth, collaborative learning, and collective action. What we learn here leaves here, right? So this convening is meant to be interactive, and you will have a chance to hear from all of our speakers as well as each other later in the evening. And just to remind folks, we're all here to learn. We all have stuff to learn. So let's definitely approach this work with humility and a commitment to action beyond these virtual walls. And lastly, keep conversations private. You will have an opportunity to interact directly with speakers here today, as well as other participants. So please keep the identities and stories you hear in your breakout rooms confidential, unless given explicit permission to share. All right, so although we have taken measures to prevent hateful and disruptive acts from occurring in this space, we also know that the topics that we're addressing are complex and very often controversial. So if we do experience trolling, Zoom bombing, or other forms of disruption, we will address the situation as swiftly as possible. In the event of a prolonged interruption, we will show the following screen to let you all know that we'll be right back. We are attending to the situation and we'll return shortly. All right, so now that we have some ground rules laid out, we can officially get started with our program. It is my pleasure to introduce our President and Executive Director, John Yang.
Great. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And welcome to everyone tonight. Actually, as I was looking at the chat box, I see a lot of familiar names, friends, and faces. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So for those of you that do not know who Advancing Justice AAJC is, let me tell you a little bit about the organization and what our hopes are for tonight. Our organization was founded in 1991. The mission of our organization is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and to promote and advance a fair and equitable society for all. Now, we work through a number of independent affiliates. We have independent affiliates in Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. We're all managed independently, but we work together on common projects. And in fact, you will hear from Grace Pye, the Executive Director of Advancing Justice Chicago, on her wonderful efforts to get the TEACH Act passed in Illinois. And I know that there are a number of you that are part of our Community Partners Network. We have a Community Partners Network of over 250 organizations in 38 states, plus the District of Columbia, really trying to stitch together sort of how we work on issues around public policy, issues around community empowerment, and just education narratives generally together. And we do litigate. So if necessary, we do file cases in court. So as I was thinking about this, what we're hoping to get out of this is, the reality is our nation has always struggled in talking about racism, some of the institutional issues that address all of us and divide all of us. And on one hand, we have at times seen progress. The tragic events around George Floyd, coupled with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, did allow us to have a moment where we did have a racial reckoning, where people were starting to talk about race in a different way. Certainly in the last 2 years with COVID-19, there became an increasing awareness, unfortunately, a tragic increasing awareness of the violence against our communities, the Asian American communities. So on one hand, we have had at times steps forward. Unfortunately, in the last few months, we have seen clearly steps backward, where there are legislatures, there are individuals, there are groups that are pushing back against this notion of being able to talk about race, be able to talk about history in a smart and truthful way. Because the reality is, unless we could talk about these histories with all of its nuances, we aren't going to dismantle the institutional racism that all of us face. So that's why I'm excited about tonight and the launch of our Wholestory Education campaign and working with all of you to get this right, to get this piece right about how we talk about the whole story of America, the whole story of our communities and all of their different complexities. What we have to do is we have to break down stereotypes. We have to break down barriers that put us into these different silos, to have honest conversations about the fact that, what slavery meant to the United States, how we displaced indigenous people, Native Americans from their lands here in the United States, the contributions of Latinos and the Hispanic American population to the United States, and of course, our Asian American population. If we can't talk about those in honest ways, then we're not talking about the history of America. And so that's what we really want to ground ourselves in and thinking about how to build that future and build that greater understanding in for our community. So we're looking forward to hearing from all of you tonight and really what's happening on the ground in your states, in your localities. What are the struggles that you're facing? What are the questions that you have in trying to address and grapple with some of these issues? Because our hope is through this Wholestory Education campaign, our hope is to empower all of you all the advocates, all the allies, both in this room and throughout the country, to get the knowledge, get the resources, and create the networks necessary to really cause that change. That change is hard. Clearly, that change is hard, but that change is necessary in our school system, just generally in our communities, to tell the whole story of America and make sure that we're included in all that narrative. So I look forward to the discussions and our convening tonight, and look forward to working with all of you into the future as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I have to say, I'm getting a little bit emotional seeing everybody share their reflections in the chat on what historical events have shaped their view of self and their view of community. So many of our parents or grandparents came to this country so that we could get a better education, so that we could have more opportunity. And right now, I definitely feel this intention among our community to pass that on and to pay that forward. So just wanted to share that today. And going into our agenda, we are already well underway, as you can see. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Wholestory Education campaign, then hand it over to our speakers. And then last but not least, we'll break out into groups to talk about community-specific needs and observations. So before I launch into the Wholestory Education campaign, we're going to launch our first poll to understand sort of who's in the room today, so that we can better group folks for our discussion later on. So take a moment to fill out the poll. We know that education is everyone's business. They don't say knowledge is power for no reason, right? This is about knowledge. This is about power for our communities and for our children to shape their futures. Awesome. Maybe 5 more seconds. Okay. Great. All right, thank you so much. All right, so it looks like we have a good mix of folks. We got teachers, parents, students, and also nonprofit staff who I'm sure have multiple identities that were named here on this poll today. So thank you so much for sharing. It's good to have you. All right, so this convening marks the launch of Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC's Wholestory Education campaign, or the WE campaign. We are standing on the shoulders of our movement forebears across communities of color who fought for ethnic studies and civil rights over decades and centuries. And we hope to take up our torch in the relay towards a more inclusive future for our students, children, and siblings. We're calling this the WE campaign because it is truly for all of our communities: Asian American, Black American, Latinx, Indigenous, as well as all of the all allied historically marginalized communities within and across those larger groups. So our objective today is to learn from and connect with Asian American advocates fighting for inclusive curriculum, and to also help you identify and combat harmful disinformation that seeks to divide us from other historically marginalized community. The rest, we're hoping to get ideas from you all for where to take this campaign, what's next, what's needed, and help shape a collaborative effort moving forward. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. You'll be hearing today from Jenny Liu, our Mis and Disinformation Policy Analyst at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and later from Grace Pai, the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. So I'm going to go with that. I'm just going to let Jenny take it away here.
Awesome. Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. We're really excited. So to start us off, we thought we would get a sense of everyone's familiarity with the controversy surrounding critical race theory. So if you could take a few moments to answer the poll question and rate your familiarity from not familiar at all to very familiar. So we'll give folks a few moments to respond. Okay, it looks like some responses are still trickling in, so we'll give folks a few more seconds here. Okay, awesome. So it seems like the vast majority of folks have at least are somewhat familiar to very familiar with what's happening here. If we could go to the next slide, please. Great. So with that in mind, I think we wanted to just kind of give a broad overview of what's going on around this controversy with critical race theory. And so what's really interesting, right, is 2 years ago, outside of maybe some very specific circles of academia, most Americans probably had never heard about or really thought about CRT or critical race theory. But over the past year and a half, it's really just been catapulted in such a divisive and um, culture war issue that affects so many aspects of American life. And so at its core, right, this right-wing framing of what they deem critical race theory is just a very strategic disinformation campaign under which anything related to race, equity, or diversity is labeled critical race theory. And because critical race theory as a legal concept, which I will get into on the next slide, is nuanced, it's complex, and it's not something that can be easily summarized in 1 or 2 sentences, it really is the perfect scapegoat and boogeyman. And in essence, through this disinformation campaign, right-wing bad actors are able to portray critical race theory essentially as whatever they want it to be. Next slide, please. So in terms of what the definition of critical race theory actually is, right? So it's a legal framework that helps us to understand how racism is embedded within so many aspects of our lives, right? So everything from our housing markets, our labor markets, our court systems that ultimately have resulted in disparate outcomes by race. So critical race theory really rejects the notion that racism is something that's individualistic in nature and really likes to look at how it is something that's much more systemic and embedded within so many aspects of our lives. And so if you take a look at this word cloud on the right, this is just a really brief sampling of the kinds of misrepresentations of CRT that we've seen by right-wing bad actors. So all sorts of absurd accusations that it's indoctrination, that it's Marxist, that it's modern day Jim Crow, right? All of which don't have any basis in fact. And so what's kind of confusing and what's so strategic about this controversy, right, is that there is critical race theory as a legal theory, as I just defined, and then there's what the right has painted CRT to be, and then there's what they're using this skewed portrayal to attack, right, which is more so conversations around diversity, conversations around race and equity that we'll talk about a little bit more. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so what's really interesting about this is that these right-wing bad actors have been quite transparent from the beginning about what they're seeking to do here. So in the words of Christopher Rufo of the Manhattan Institute, their goal with drumming up this controversy around critical race theory is to inject critical race theory into public discourse, steadily drive up negative perceptions, and then the ultimate goal is to have someone read a negative headline, perhaps about race, in the newspaper and immediately think, oh, this is because of critical race theory. So in a lot of senses, he's right in that they've been able to successfully make critical race theory the perfect villain. Next slide, please. So here we just have some examples of false or misleading portrayals of critical race theory that we've seen on social media. So instances where really prominent political figures have manipulated and utilized their bully pulpits to spread all sorts of mis and disinformation about what critical race theory actually is. Next slide, please. And what's especially alarming, right, is has been some very successful community-specific targeted messaging around this topic. So one especially pernicious narrative is this idea that's spreading among Chinese Americans that critical race theory is an American version of the Cultural Revolution that divides people on race rather than class, right? Which is of course absurd, but it just represents a very strategic exploitation of a sensitive subject that of course leaves a lot of first generation immigrants especially vulnerable. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, just to kind of switch gears a little bit, as a result of all of this drummed up and manufactured controversy, right, we've seen anti-CRT bills emerging around the country. And what's alarming is that these bills not only have targeted race and conversations around that, but also have gone further to also target gender and sexual identity. And whereas a lot of these bills started out targeting K through 12 education, there are also a new slew of bills targeted at higher education and speech in universities. Next slide, please. So in terms of where this all began, the origins of these bills can really be traced back to the summer of 2020 and a lot of the protests surrounding the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and America's quote unquote summer of racial reckoning. So a lot of conservative bad actors saw these conversations around things like white privilege and institutional racism and just frankly felt threatened, right? And so back in June of 2020, Christopher Rufo, who I had quoted earlier, appeared on Fox News to talk about these diversity trainings that were being taken place in Seattle for federal workers that he argued sought to indoctrinate these workers with, quote, leftist concepts like racial superiority and institutional racism. And he called on Donald Trump, then president, to pass an executive order banning these things. And in September 2020, the Trump administration did just that, and they passed the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, which prohibited federal agencies from conducting racial sensitivity trainings and anything the administration labeled as divisive concepts, claiming that these trainings were anti-American propaganda. So lawsuits quickly followed, and the Biden administration, of course, rescinded the executive order as soon as President Biden took office in January of last year. But at that point, it was already too late, and copycat bills had begun to emerge all across the country. Next slide, please. So just to give some honestly quite frightening numbers, since January of last year, 156 bills have been introduced or pre-filed across 39 different states. 12 of these bills have become law in 10 states, and 112 bills are currently live across 35 states. So this isn't really something that's only affecting a small portion of the country. It's really affecting the vast majority of states and students in this country. Next slide, please. So in terms of what these bills actually seek to do, I like to think of them kind of falling into three different categories. So the first of which call for the very specific ban of concepts, ideals, or even specific books. So we've seen state legislatures move to ban the teaching of Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project. And while a lot of book bans that we've seen have taken place more so at the school board level, there have been also instances of state legislatures mandating book bans as well. One particularly alarming instance of a school board banning books was actually raised to us in which a Tennessee school district recently moved to ban the novel Dragon Wings, which is a 1975 Newbery Award-winning novel that discusses the struggles and trials of Chinese immigrants navigating San Francisco. So just a lot of really, really terrible censorship that's happening both at the local level and at the state level. Next slide, please. So other sets of these bills are a little bit broader in nature, right? So they seek to ban certain feelings even, or broad concepts or topics. So these are like Virginia banning divisive concepts, or Florida's introduction of the Don't Say Gay bill, which essentially prohibits K through 12 teachers from encouraging classroom discussion about sexual identity in primary school levels. Next slide, please. And so another set of these bills, right, are those that advocate for curriculum transparency, or parents' bills of rights. So these bills aim to make instructional materials available for parental review, and on their own, right, that doesn't seem like it's especially dangerous, but what's really harmful about these bills is they also give parents the ability to take legal action against schools or teachers that are quote unquote non-compliant. So we've seen things like Virginia's Governor Glenn Youngkin setting up a tip line to report any instances where parents have seen divisive teaching practices. And we've also even seen cash prizes being offered for parents who report teachers who have been caught teaching these banned concepts. Next slide, please. So here are just some additional examples of specific pieces of legislation that have been introduced or even passed across the country. And I think something really important to call out here is that this whole manufactured controversy really tries to push the idea that our children are being indoctrinated, right, by an influx of radical concepts and ideas. But what they're really stifling, right, is existing conversations that have been going on for decades in American classrooms around things like the civil rights movement, the Trail of Tears. One particularly alarming headline that actually came out recently was an Indiana school district allowing parents to opt out of Black History Month. So it's just important to remember that this is all really just manufactured madness, right? And it just has such a profound chilling effect on teachers who are scared that teaching the truth might cost them their jobs. And we've definitely seen that happen, which is, of course, terrible. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we thought it would be useful to take a moment for everyone to sound off in the chat to talk about what you, in your capacity here as an educator, as a student, as an advocate, whatever, what you see as the impact of these bills and what you see as coming out of these bills. And just to be cognizant of time, we'll just give folks a few minutes to respond here, but and also acknowledging that later on in the session, once we move to breakout rooms, folks will have an additional time to kind of expand more on the ideas that discussed here. Okay. Yeah, definitely seeing some chatter about teachers being scared of teaching the truth, marginalized groups feeling further excluded, reading fears. Okay, awesome. I think just in the interest of time, we can move on and kind of expand on these topics more in the breakout room sessions. But yeah, so in terms of why this matters to Asian American communities, right? Of course, no children benefit from learning these whitewashed versions of history. And when it's really harmful for Asian American children and all children to be denied opportunities to learn the histories of a diverse America. And I think especially for Asian American communities, right, which are often portrayed as a monolith, learning whitewashed history really is a missed opportunity to understand more about the diverse immigrant stories, cultures and languages that make each of our communities so unique. And of course, right, this ignorance has consequences, as we've seen it during the past 2 years with rise in violence against Asian Americans, And just this idea that if Asian American children don't see themselves as fully American, and if other people don't see Asian Americans as fully American, that of course has implications for things like racial profiling, anti-Asian hate, and more. And so all of this is to say that, of course, like learning our histories, ensuring that history books reflect the diversity of the children who read them are so important in chipping away at things like the perpetual foreigner myth and model minority stereotypes. So I think that is a really good segue into the next piece of our session, and hearing about all of the amazing things that Grace and our partners over at Advancing Justice Chicago are doing with the TEACH Act in Illinois. So I will pass the mic over to Grace. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you for that really helpful and thorough overview of CRT and the anti-CRT efforts that are all around the country. My name is Grace Pai. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago. So we are sister organizations with AAJC, really excited to collaborate in this way. And just wanted to give a shout out to the AAJC team for inviting me to participate and to share with you all a little bit about how we won an Asian American history requirement in Illinois. So I think particularly given the context of what Jenny shared, it's important for us not just to be on defense. We need to also be on offense, right? We've seen the right do this really well, where they're introducing bills that don't even have a shot of passing and changing the public narrative about what's going on. And so I think it's really critical that we are, of course, fighting back when these things are happening in our communities, in our backyards, but also putting forward the solutions that we know that our communities need so that we can, both create and really build hope for what we want our education system to be like, but also create real tangible changes in the places where it is possible to win a requirement, whether it's ethnic studies broadly or Asian American history specifically. So I'm excited to share a little bit about how we got that done in Illinois. Just want to do a quick audio check. Can folks hear me okay? Okay, perfect, great. So next slide, please. So what is the TEACH Act? The TEACH Act stands for Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. And it's a long, unwieldy acronym, but local politics, you have to have a good acronym. So we worked really hard to come up with something that was kind of catchy, that people would really connect to the purpose of our bill, which is to teach a more equitable version of our history, right? To teach our real history, honest history, the truth. And so the TEACH Act, which was House Bill 376 in Illinois, amends the Illinois school code to require all public schools to teach a unit of Asian American history. We know that this is so important because of all the things that you all shared in the chat about what we didn't learn in school, what it would have meant to many of us who identify as Asian American to learn about the contributions of members of our community, of people who look like us. And you can see in the photo, we had lots of youth involved in this effort. So all the people pictured were current high schoolers at the time that this bill was signed. They're standing with our governor, J.B. Pritzker, in July. And many of them have graduated and are not going to be able to experience the impact of this bill, but they worked so hard to make it happen. Our bill in Illinois was a bipartisan victory. We only needed 60 votes in the House, in the Illinois House, to pass the bill, but we got 98. We didn't have a single opposition vote in the Senate. And there are lots of Republicans in Illinois. A lot of the areas outside of the Chicago metropolitan area are much more conservative, are much more red. And we did not see the kind of debate around CRT come up during our advocacy. And, I think it was also a really important political moment because of the rise in anti-Asian violence, that legislators were motivated to do something in support of Asian American communities. And we were able to capture that momentum and channel it into something that we felt could help address the root causes of anti-Asian racism and violence, right? Like there has been, of course, a lot of violence happening, and it's important to do something after it happens, but responding to violence after it happens doesn't prevent it from happening in the future. And so our goal with this bill was to really ensure that all young people, all students in Illinois are learning about the contributions of Asian Americans and are, building more of that empathy to relate to people who are different from them, so that they don't buy into negative stereotypes as often, so that they're not, throwing Asian Americans under the bus for COVID or scapegoating Asian Americans, that we have to start somewhere. So I do want to also note that our bill language was modeled after the existing Black history requirement in the Illinois school code. So we did have precedent, right, for inclusive history in our state. I know that that may not be the case in all the states that you are in, but I think it's important to have that eye towards, solidarity between communities of color. If your state doesn't have a Black history requirement, or, any sort of marginalized group history being included in the school code, how can you create a coalition effort and build solidarity? And the most recent inclusive history bill that was passed in Illinois was for the LGBTQ community. And so we were able to really collaborate, talk with them about what worked, what didn't work. And they were very supportive to us in this effort to add Asian American history to the list of requirements. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of our advocacy timeline, I thought it might be helpful for people to kind of visualize how long it took for us to get this bill passed. I will say in Illinois, we do have a Democratic trifecta. So our state House and state Senate are both have Democratic supermajorities, and our governor is also a Democrat. However, as you can see, we passed the bill with broad bipartisan margins. And I think that it is absolutely possible to point to that, especially if you are in a red state, and say, look, Illinois is in the Midwest. It's not a coastal state. It's not a New York. It's not a California. And they passed this bill and Republicans supported it, if you kind of need, an example to point to. But to kind of give you a sense, this took us about a year and a half. We first created the bill language in February of 2020. And so Advancing Justice Chicago, as the lead organization, wrote the language. Like, we didn't, ask a legislator to write it, we wrote it ourselves, and you can find it online. I'm happy to share it with folks. It's very simple. So if you can find your school code and look through and think about, okay, what are the different requirements that are in here? How can we make it more inclusive? That's a great place to start. We convened a coalition. The Pan-Asian Voter Empowerment Coalition is one that we've worked with for more than 10 years. And so we had this infrastructure already of Asian American organizations representing different ethnic groups being involved on state advocacy together. And so we had all partnered with each other before. It created a really strong foundation. But if you don't have, your own local coalition, you can absolutely create one. And I think that that is an important part of how we got this done. It was a broad coalition effort with different types of organizations contributing different things. We approached our Senate bill sponsor in April of 2020, which, you'll notice this was right when the pandemic started. And so in March, when we were launching this effort, we realized, oh, we're going to have to make a lot of changes, because all of a sudden we're all living in COVID land and we didn't know how that was going to impact things. So as it turns out, our state legislative session basically shut down. And it typically runs from January to May, and they stopped meeting. There was no travel happening, and they weren't considering any bills that were not urgently related to COVID relief and COVID response. So basically we tabled it until the fall and prepared to reintroduce the bill in the January 2021 session, when that gave us time to approach a House sponsor. So our sponsors are shown there on the slide. And we did ask Asian American sponsors to champion our bill. I also don't think that's a necessity. I think any state legislator who values inclusive history being taught in schools is a great champion, and you don't have to have an Asian American be the lead on your bill. We had committee hearings that overlapped with the March Atlanta spa shootings. We're coming up on the anniversary. The House hearing in the Education Committee actually took place the day after the shootings. So it ended up being a really timely sort of response to be able to point to something specifically that we wanted legislators to take action on. And we passed the bill through the 2021 session, and it was signed into law in July. So in total, I would say about a year and a half, but in reality, the times when we were working the hardest to pass the bill, it was a period of about 8 months. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We did a ton of legislative outreach. That is the most important thing, especially at the local level, is to talk directly to the people who are decision makers. And so for us, those were state legislators. We set up as many meetings as we could. We reached out to offices, to staffers, and had strong relationships with our bill sponsors who reached out to their own colleagues and said, hey, can I count on you to vote yes on this legislation that I'm carrying? And them being the messengers to state legislators that we weren't able to get meetings with was really critical. We did a lot of narrative building work through earned media and social media. We felt it was important to kind of shape the narrative around why this was important. And so we had already been getting a lot of media inquiries asking us as an organization to comment on what was happening, in terms of anti-Asian racism. And so we tied in this Asian American history bill. We said, well, here's one of the things we think should be done to address Asian American racism. And that helped connect the dots, I think, both for the broader public and for legislators. We also mobilized our community. I think the most important thing that we did in this effort was we built a strong base of community members and volunteers who were involved and who were really driving this process. I mean, especially local legislators, they want to do things to make their constituents happy. So if you can mobilize their constituents to uplift an issue or to ask them to vote yes or to ask them to co-sponsor, that is really, really impactful. And so being able to build your base of support is critical. I see a question about earned media. Sorry, that is a kind of a jargony phrase. Earned media basically means sort of mainstream media like newspapers or radio stations. It's earned because in that sense, it's free. You're not paying for paid ads. You're getting reporters to cover the work that you're doing. And it's kind of that like free or earned, quote unquote, earned publicity. So social media, right, we can control, we can put out there, but earned media was us getting news coverage. And lastly, we recruited a diverse list of organizations to support and to be endorsers of our bill, and being able to have that full list of organizations that were not just from the Asian American community demonstrated to legislators that this issue is important to people beyond the Asian American community. And I think that was really helpful for us in moving legislators to be supportive. So the next slide shows just some snapshots of the media coverage that we got. We got coverage on specifically our bill, right? After the passage, before the passage, during the campaign. We worked with high school youth to pen their own op-eds to get those placed in local media outlets, right? So the student here, Bailey, who's pictured, goes to school and lives in the suburbs of Chicago. And so we targeted a suburban newspaper, a slightly smaller paper, right? Because we knew that that would help kind of reach that suburban audience that other outlets might not catch. And so I think thinking about the different perspectives that you have in your coalition, you might have parent perspectives, you might have teacher perspectives, you might have researchers or, higher education professionals who can all offer different perspectives. I think that can be a real asset in terms of getting media coverage. Next slide, please. So just to quantify our impact for you a little bit, I talked about the importance of mobilizing a base. So what did we do with that base? We had over 20 volunteer leaders who took on significant leadership and campaign responsibilities. So for example, we had an immigrant justice team of leaders that met regularly and did things like setting up meetings with elected officials, like prepping other volunteers to take on roles in those meetings. So we didn't have staff doing all of that work because that would be incredibly limiting, but we had volunteer leaders themselves who were taking on, doing things for the first time, taking on new responsibilities, developing their own leadership and learning in that process. We had a team of volunteer leaders who were tasked with outreach that built a list of different entities that we wanted to ask to sign on so that we could build that broad list of supporters. We had folks who organized their own community education workshops and sessions to make sure that we were getting the word out to as broad a group as possible. And through all of that outreach, we were able to collect 65 personal testimonies from individuals about why it was important to them that the Teach Act be passed into law. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, there's an image that we had one of the some of the testimonies illustrated by artists who volunteered to contribute to the campaign. And that was a really powerful way of sharing those testimonies on our social media. We sent over 15,000 text messages to Illinois voters asking them to contact their legislators in support of the TEACH Act. We got 859 emails from constituents to their legislators, and we mobilized over 1,000 witness slips in support of the bill in advance of key committee votes. So that's a kind of specific Illinois thing. In Illinois, before a bill is considered and voted on in committee, there's a page where you can fill it out and indicate whether you personally or your organization supports or opposes a bill. And that's what's called a witness slip. And so you can just submit that page, and then during the hearing, they'll say, okay, there were 500 witness slips in support, 20 witness slips neutral, 30 witness slips against. And so that's a great way of demonstrating your support to the people who will be voting on your bill before it makes it to the floor. Next slide, please. So I know there's a question in the chat about implementation, so I want to briefly touch on that also. We will be providing free professional development workshops for teachers and compiling quality curricular resources, including lesson plans, book lists, primary sources, all of that to share. And I'll drop a link to that, to our list of resources in the chat after I'm done talking. We're partnering with different stakeholders, including universities and teachers unions, elected officials, the Illinois State Board of Education, to make sure that we can amplify the work that we're doing, the resources that we're compiling, the trainings that we're offering. And we're continuing to engage youth through the Teach Youth Council. And to the question in the chat about who writes or creates the curriculum, in Illinois, and this is different in every state, schools have local control over curriculum. So the Illinois State Board of Education cannot mandate a specific curriculum. They cannot say, here's model curriculum that all schools need to follow. It's completely up to the local school and school district. And so what we're doing is, rather than creating a curriculum per se, we're providing a suite of resources and some different samples about how to incorporate Asian American history into lesson plans throughout the school year based on grade level, to give teachers a kind of menu of options. Our bill requires a unit. A unit is defined differently, again, by the local level. In some schools, it might be considered, 5 days of instruction, and in other schools, it might be 3 days of instruction. But honestly, we don't want a teacher to just teach Asian American history for 3 days in May because it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month and call it a day. We would much prefer that they incorporate Asian American history holistically throughout the whole year. When they're talking about World War II, talk about Japanese American internment. When they're talking about civil rights movements and organizing in the 60s, they're talking about Filipino farm workers. When they're talking about school segregation, they're talking about Chinese American families like the Tate family that fought school segregation, right? We want it to be incorporated and not just kind of say, okay, I'll do 3 days and then I'm done. And so that's a really important part of how we decided to create our resources. And we had many, many educators, both current teachers and former teachers, contribute to that to kind of give us a sense of how do we create resources that will be the most useful and practical for teachers who obviously have been through a really tough 2 years. It's hard to ask teachers to do more right now. And so we wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to incorporate Asian American history and to do it well. So I will close my presentation there. And I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Grace and Jenny, for those amazing presentations. We're getting really great feedback in the chat, as well as a few questions. So one question that was asked was, where are, now that the TEACH Act is passed, where are folks getting their curriculum resources? And what resources are out there that you're aware of that you might be able to share here?
So resources, let me just drop a link in the chat. There are many different organizations that have, oh, sorry, I realize that's not a clickable link. Maybe if somebody else can drop that link for me in the chat, that would be great. we compiled what we're calling the Asian American Education Resource Database. I think that is the right acronym. We basically built it to be filterable by grade level and to link directly to resources that teachers can use, whether those are lesson plans or videos or documentaries, primary sources, things like that. And so, you can find that on the link that Juwon just linked. Thank you so much. And it brings in resources from lots of different sources. So there's, for example, the Asian American Education Project, which has created a suite of lesson plans. There's PBS that has various documentaries and their own lesson plans. There's the 1882 Foundation. There's the URI Education Project, right? There are lots of different entities out there that have built resources for teachers. So what we tried to do is create a centralized database where teachers can see it in a very easily digestible way, filter by their grade level, filter by a topic. Maybe they have a unit on citizenship already, then they can see, okay, what are all the citizenship related lessons in here? And so that was our approach to kind of compiling resources all into one place.
Great, thank you so much. I know, Grace, we have you for just a limited time, but would love to hear about how you would suggest building a stronger base in the Asian community to support ethnic studies or CRT. We'd love to, we know that you, in addition to leading the charge in Illinois, have consulted and advised many other activists in different states. So I'd love to hear some examples or success stories of that sort of coalition building in Illinois or elsewhere.
Absolutely. And so I think anybody can organize and build a base. And that's what's so powerful about it. It's as simple as reaching out to people who care about this issue, whether maybe you're a parent and there are fellow parents, or maybe you're a student and there are fellow students, right? Bringing together people who have a similar interest and a similar goal, a similar vision to come together. And it's as simple as meeting regularly, right? Building a container. Maybe you have a biweekly meeting or a monthly meeting. You gather on Zoom or at someone's house. And the key part of base building is asking other people to get involved. So each of you can say, commit to, okay, I'll ask 5 people I know if they care about this and want to get involved. Maybe 2 of those 5 people will say yes. And then all of a sudden, if everybody comes back and has gotten 2 more people to be involved, your base has grown. The key part about base building is defining roles that people can take on, right? And like building a team that really meets all of the different needs that you have. So maybe one person is point on developing legislative relationships. Maybe another is point on community outreach, right? And I think that one of the key parts of leadership is inviting people in to take on specific roles. Like, don't be afraid to offer up ideas or to define roles, to ask people to take on certain things, because that's the only way that we get things done. And honestly, building the infrastructure for the long term will have such an incredible impact on our ecosystem overall. I would love it. I mean, for us, the Teach Act is one bill of many that we have championed over the years. If you win something like this, you can win something bigger as long as you keep building, right? And so rather than kind of thinking of it as okay, one-off, we're going to all work together on this one thing, but then nothing else, I really encourage you to look towards, are there organizations in your community that have done this type of work? Can you approach them? Can you collaborate with them? There's no need to recreate the wheel. You don't need to do something on your own just because you have this idea. There are lots of great, I think, entities to collaborate with in the Asian American landscape and in the community organizing landscape overall.
And we have another question from a participant about reaching out to institutions to offer, higher ed institutions to offer continuing education for teachers. A lot of folks are wondering how we can start to integrate more inclusive curriculum, and especially educators are wondering how they can advocate for their students' education in this way.
Yeah, what is the specific question?
About continuing education for educators to teach new curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, just about reaching out and seeing what sort of ideas you can share, what infrastructure you can help build. For us in Illinois, one of our flagship institutions, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, there are a few professors there who also identify as Asian American, who were so excited about the Teach Act that they developed a proposal for a micro-credential program that teachers can complete to get credit, right? And to do that continuing education, to get that professional development certification. So I think it can look like a bunch of different things. Often it does cost money, right? So you have to fundraise to be able to create new programs like that. You know, we, in our case, Advancing Justice Chicago, took on the role of fundraising to create free teacher trainings. Lots of other organizations also offer these kinds of resources, like the Asian American Education Project, for example. And so I think it's really about figuring out how to bring those resources that are out there to your community and build on what's already there.
Awesome. So one last question. And this one's kind of a doozy because I think everyone is going to have a slightly different answer to this. And the question is, why is it that Asian American and Asian immigrant students are usually not mentioned or involved in the picture when discussing issues of inequity and marginalization? So that could be a convening unto itself, but would love to hear your take, Grace.
Yeah, and then right after this, I'll have to hop off. So sorry that I have to leave early, but you know, that is a fascinating question. And yes, I think everybody would have a different answer. I mean, for me personally, I feel like one of the reasons that it's all structural, that one of the reasons why Asian Americans are often not talked about or often not included in our history books is just kind of about the ways that our policies and laws and culture have treated Asian Americans as an other, have treated Asian Americans as invisible, right? That when we think about the earliest immigration laws, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, that literally the first immigration laws in our country were made to exclude Asians. And that continued for decades, literally until the 1960s, when we finally overhauled our immigration system to make it more fair and to make it less racist, right? And so I think when people, when a community has been treated that way, when that's baked into white supremacy, you know, that one community doesn't belong, isn't truly American, shouldn't be here, that kind of seeps into how we talk about communities, how we teach about the communities that are here. Certainly there's also the model minority myth, right, which is kind of a different side of that coin. And I think all of those things kind of contribute to Asian Americans not really being uplifted as a community that has experienced real oppression and harm in the United States, and also that is here and is here to stay. Thank you so much for having me, and sorry that I have to hop off, but hope you all enjoy the rest of the program.
Thanks so much, Grace. All right, so we have a couple more minutes for questions. So feel free to share in the chat if you have any questions for Jenny or any one of us. If not, we can go ahead and head into breakout rooms. Going once, going twice. I think it's just really fascinating that we're talking about misinformation and disinformation as though we're starting from a fair baseline, right? Because the education, we argue, that we receive now is a form of misinformation and disinformation, just by virtue of what is not taught as part of our curriculum. So, you know, something to keep things in perspective, it occurs to me that what we don't learn is also misinformation, right? It's also a form of misdirection and control of the narrative. So really appreciate both Jenny and Grace's presentation and lessons learned from both their research and organizing. Awesome. And I'm seeing people dropping stuff in the chat. Hi, Tessa. Yes, we are really excited to break out into groups to understand what you all are up to in this regard and how we can collaborate and connect on driving bills like the one that was introduced in Ohio recently forward, and get other bills introduced in other places too. All right, so it sounds like we are ready for breakouts. So listen carefully, because this is not going to be your average breakout activity. Because we wanted to keep this event as secure as possible and prevent any disruptions, Zoom bombing, et cetera, we're actually going to send folks into breakout meetings. So in the chat, we will share links to join different Zoom meetings entirely. And then at the end, we'll come back together after we've had a chance to meet one another, share best practices, and discuss what's next for our community. And at the end of those meetings, you will receive another link to rejoin the larger group. We'll do a quick share out, and then we'll adjourn our convening for the night. So if folks on the AAJC team can go ahead and drop some of those links in the chat. We had to do some rearranging since we have a majority of folks who are already part of organizations fighting for Asian American equality and civil rights. We are going to have several groups that you can join based on your level of involvement in education advocacy, curriculum advocacy, et cetera. And we'll have one room for students, parents, and teachers. I'm really excited that we have like such a diverse group of stakeholders here. And next time we'll have other opportunities to converse, and just like Grace said, bring somebody with you, bring 2-3 people who you think are really passionate about this topic. So without further ado, we're going to send folks out into their meeting rooms, and we will see you on the other side.
Okay, y'all, if you look in the chat, please go ahead and feel free to pick whichever meeting room. I am going to enter them again. So the first link we have is for educators, parents, and teachers. So I know that also, I know we also have students. So that was actually a mistype. Educators, parents, teachers, and students. Please go ahead and join in the Zoom room that I just dropped. For organizations and nonprofit staff members who are already working on the issues that we've discussed so far today. That's going to be the second link that I am about to drop. And then for folks that are nonprofit organization staff who want to work on this issue or are just getting started, that's going to be the final link I'm going to drop. So please go ahead and join those rooms, and we will have an informative discussion and strategies. So again, please feel free to pick whichever rooms. Your host will also have room links for the other room. So if you want to start off in one room and then go to another, you can do that as well. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat. Yes, I will go ahead and drop that one again. No worries, no worries. I'll put them in again. So that link that I just dropped is for nonprofit organization staff members who just got started working on the issue or want to begin working on the issue. Yes, already working on the issue. Can do. Here is that link. Okay.